Hi guys, it's me again, and this time I'm going to be showing you how you may approach writing an outline. You remember I gave you the guideline on how to approach this. You may have found your own approach and your own method of going about such a task, which is perfectly okay. You don't need to use the one that I am using and showing you now, but you may want to know how I would go about it, and therefore let's get started and I'll show you how I would go about it. Okay? So the first thing is, of course, we go back to the text. Here we are. And we go right to the first meeting of Miriam and Mrs. Miller. So we leave all the information aside that was given before, because that is none of the assignment. We proceed exactly to the first meeting of these two characters. Anything that we know about Mrs. Miller, that she's living alone because she's a widow, and that she has no friends, etc., etc., etc. This is none of this of the assignment and none of our business here with this task. We just start with the first meeting. All right, so what does the story tell us? It tells us that this girl seems to be different from the type of girls that Mrs. Miller had seen so far. And the first thing that strikes her is that her hair is silver white, like an albino. Like an albino's, it flowed waistling in smooth, loose lines. She was thin and fragilely constructed. There was a simple, special elegance in the way she stood, with her thumbs in the pockets of a tailored plum velvet coat. And the first thing that we find is Mrs. Miller felt oddly excited. So we may say, at first sight, Mrs. Miller felt oddly excited. Jesus, is this a better? This is a good color. Okay. So then we move on, and we find a sentence like this: I feel just like a genuine criminal. Remember, she had just bought a movie ticket for this little girl, and Mrs. Miller is asking herself whether she had done something that was against the law. I do hope I haven't done the wrong thing. But at the same time, the text also tells us Mrs. Miller is in a good and cheerful mood. Gaily here means cheerfully. Okay? So everything seems to be okay. We may also highlight this here in order to have a starting point. Yeah? So cheerful, she's cheerful, And this seems to be a good start. And then we also get a piece of information, kind of like foreshadowing. And this is here. The truly distinctive feature was hazel, steady, lacking any childlike quality. Eyes, they were hazel, steady, lacking any childlike quality. This is a first indication. Okay, there must be something in stock and in store for us. Okay, so this is what Mrs. Miller realizes and becomes aware of. But the narrator does not tell her if this bothers or unsettles Mrs. Miller, but she realizes there is something steady and in Miriam's look, which lacks any childlike quality whatsoever. Okay, so this is emphasized. Lacking any childlike quality whatsoever. Okay. Here, when Mrs. Miller says, oh, she's just heard the girl's name is Miriam, and Mrs. Miller says, but isn't that funny? Moderately, says Miriam. Mrs. Miller flushed and shifted uncomfortably. So here, for the very first time, it becomes obvious that she's not really all that fine with this contact. Yeah, she flushed, means her face went red, and she shifted uncomfortably. Okay, so another indication that Mrs. Miller is not all that relaxed is hastily changing the subject. Apparently, there is something embarrassing or unsettling about the girl. So even when during the first contact, when they get to know each other, there is something in the way Miriam approaches the old lady that seems to unsettle her. It doesn't scare her, but it makes her feel uncomfortable in some way. Okay, so then the second meeting. Okay. We have Mrs. Miller and Miriam almost in the middle of the night. And Miriam comes, keeps buzzing the bell. Here, the bell never paused an instant. And then, hello, why, hello, you're that little girl. I thought you'd never answer, but I kept my finger on the button. I knew you were home. Aren't you glad to see me? Mrs. Miller did not know what to say here. So she is lost for words. Uh, a regular person like me would probably say something like, no, I'm absolutely not happy, and I don't want you to come to my place at this hour of night. That would be me, but that's not Mrs. Miller. Okay, so Mrs. Miller doesn't really want to let in the girl. And as a consequence, the girl, Miriam, here, Miriam, with a gentle gesture, oops, urged Mrs. Miller aside and passed into the apartment. So at this point, the girl, for the very first time, maybe not the first time, no, it happened before, but here, even physically, she takes control of the situation. She urged Mrs. Miller aside and passed into the apartment. I mean, she intrudes upon a stranger's privacy, urging the old lady aside and just walking in. That's quite a thing, isn't it? I mean, just imagine the situation. There's somebody outside your apartment, and you want to be left in peace. You want to go to sleep soon. And then there is somebody ringing your doorbell at a persistent buzz. And when you open, that person just walks in. Yeah, with a gentle gesture. She doesn't shove the lady aside, but anyway, she urged Mrs. Miller aside. Gently, but she does so. All right. So, the next thing, Mrs. Miller sank. Or no, let's go back here. Of course, Mrs. Miller wants to know, what do you want? And again, Miriam takes control of the situation, says, sit down. It makes me nervous to see people stand. Hello? Who are you to tell me, who I am at home here, to sit down because it makes you nervous to see people stand? That's quite amazing, isn't it? I mean, just imagine the situation. Would you have a stranger tell you what to do in your home? I don't think you would. And I can tell you most definitely, I would not either. So, as a consequence, probably because she's perplexed and because she doesn't know what to do and what to say, Mrs. Miller sank to a hassock. Okay. Then the girl says, I don't think you're glad I came. And for a second time, Mrs. Miller was without an answer. Her hand motioned vaguely. Okay, so this tells us that Mrs. Miller has lost control of the situation. And of course, when somebody has lost control of a situation, there is or remains a feeling of unease. The story does not yet tell us that that Mrs. Miller is scared, but what the narrator tells us indicates that she has no strategy telling her what to do and how to get back control of her home and of the situation, and to show the girl out, right? Okay, so let's move on and watch out for further indications. Here, it's the canary. Leave Tommy alone, said Mrs. Miller anxiously. Don't you dare wake him. Okay. Then Mrs. Miller wants the girl to leave and tries to strike a bargain. Look, if I made some nice sandwiches, will you be a good child and run along home? It's past midnight, I'm sure. And what does Miriam do? She reproaches. It's snowing and cold and dark. How can you send me out? Right? Reproached Miriam. And then, well, you shouldn't have come here to begin with, said Mrs. Miller, struggling to control her voice. Another indication that she has lost, control of the situation. All right. Now, being a smoker, in this situation, Mrs. Miller paused to light a cigarette. This probably gives her relief. Those of you who never smoked and hopefully will never start smoking don't know what smokers are talking about. I can tell you, being a smoker myself, that this would be a situation in which I would also light a cigarette. Her hand shook as she held the match. Fascinated. Well, fascinated here doesn't mean impressed or awed or so. It means gebannt. She is in Miriam's bann, so to say. Okay. And then we have another indication here. She inhaled the cigarette and discovered she had lighted the cork. Well, why? And all of a sudden thinks to herself, oh really, she mustn't lose her temper. So apparently here we get the first indication of Mrs. Miller being scared. The word scare or fear or angst or anxiety, well, anxiously was mentioned once, but the words fear, terror, angst, anxiety, etc., have not been mentioned yet. But wait, we're not yet through. Okay, so let's move on. And here's another hint that puzzles the old lady. Miriam glanced up, and in her eyes there was a look that was not ordinary. Miriam, she studied Mrs. Miller, forcing their eyes to meet. Forcing, right? Here, forcing. Okay, so the next thing that the next piece of information we find Mrs. Miller feeling suddenly the need of some support. Well, the only support she finds is the door frame here. But there are physical symptoms of the fear that has not been named as fear. Okay, so here it says her head was unbearably heavy. A pressure weighted the rhythm of her heartbeat. So all of a sudden, there are physical symptoms. The head is heavy, unbearably heavy, and a pressure weighted the rhythm of her heartbeat. Okay, so this is also something that we want to collect here in order to later include certain things in our outline. All right. Here we know there was no one to whom she might turn. Remember? Feeling suddenly the need of some support. But all there is the door frame here. And now it came to Mrs. Miller that there was no one to whom she might turn. She was alone. Okay. Its sheer emphasis was stunning. Okay. And then Miriam ate ravenously. You remember, Miriam moved from one elderly person to another, and the last man was terribly poor, and we never had good things to eat. That's what Miriam said to Mrs. Miller. And here, of course, the story confirms this information. She ate ravenously. So she greedily, she wolfs down the sandwiches and the milk that Mrs. Miller had prepared for her. Yeah. This is a more literary expression for, let's say, informal, she wolfed down. Okay. Well, then Mrs. Miller comes to realize that the cameo that she owns gleamed on Miriam's blouse. And this also has an effect. And we here get quite a good description on how Mrs. Miller disintegrates increasingly. And this is the complete paragraph here. Her hairnet had slipped lopsided, loose strands straggled down her face. Her eyes were stupidly concentrated on nothing. Her cheeks were mottled in red patches. Mottled in red patches. In German, you would probably say, sie hatte hektische Flecken. Okay? As though a fierce slap had left permanent marks. A fierce slap. Well, probably this is a very good expression and a very good metaphor for what has been happening on this evening while Miriam is visiting her. Okay, and another piece of information is given here. Mrs. Miller tapped ash on the rug. Her head swayed slightly as she tried to focus her eyes. So, we should also include this because this tells us she's no longer paying attention to what she is doing, what she needs to do. She forgets about the cigarette she is smoking, therefore she tapped ash on the rug. On the other hand, we also know, because this was told us previously, that she kept her apartment immaculately clean. So this is none of her habits. This is just happening because she has lost control. She's lost control. She's disintegrating, and she can't deal with the situation anymore. Well, at this point, she reminds Mrs. Miller reminds Miriam that Miriam had promised to leave when she's had her meal, and here Mrs. Miller says, "It was a promise, and I'm tired and I don't feel well at all." Well, yes, we understand, because based on all the information above, we perfectly understand that Mrs. Miller is no longer feeling well. Not only she isn't feeling good, she isn't even feeling well anymore. Okay? So, and then we have this violent situation. Presently, she bent close. Miriam, we're talking about Miriam here. Presently, she bent close to Mrs. Miller and whispered, "Kiss me good night." And of course, Mrs. Miller says, "Please, I'd rather not." And Miriam lifted a shoulder, arched an eyebrow. "Okay, if you don't obey, I must punish you as you like," she she said, and went directly to the coffee table, seized the vase containing the paper roses, carried it to where the hard surface on the floor lay bare, and hurled it downward. Glass sprayed, and she stamped her foot on the bouquet. All right, so next day, Mrs. Miller stays in bed. She's had a nervous breakdown. Her dreams were feverishly agitated. Their unbalanced mood lingered even as she lay staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. Okay, and then she has several dreams, and we know she is having a bad crisis. Okay, but Tuesday morning she woke up feeling better. Great. And now the story tells us what she's doing until at precisely 5 the doorbell rang. And of course, Mrs. Miller knew who it was, and she might have kept the door shut. But she doesn't. She just says, "Go away." The girl says, "Please hurry, I have a heavy package." That's the box with all her possessions. "Go away." She returned to the living room, lighted the cigarette, sat down and calmly listened to the buzzer. On and on and on. Here, Mrs. Miller, for the very first time, and she tries to resist the girl's commands. "You might as well leave. I have no intention of letting you in." Shortly, the bell stopped. For possibly 10 minutes, Mrs. Miller did not move. Then, hearing no sound, she concluded Miriam had gone. She tiptoed to the door and opened it a sliver. Miriam was half reclining atop a cardboard box with a beautiful French doll cradled in her arms. Well, she shouldn't have gone to the front door, right? Mrs. Miller should have stayed where she was, should have smoked her cigarette, maybe another 2 cigarettes, and just should have done nothing at all. And, well, the girl is there. And all of a sudden, we find Mrs. Miller felt a curious passivity. Of course, Miriam is again in control of the situation.